Theoretical and empirical research on wealth inequality has been expanding over time, and it's a very active research field right now. And there are many reasons for this to be the case and why research on inequality has been attracting a great deal of attention. First of all, it is important to recognize the national account data show that private accumulation of wealth has been growing substantially over time, and that high-income countries especially have become more and more capitalized and patrimonialized. So the graph taken here from the work of Piketty and Zuckman and the World Inequality Report show the evolution of a very simple indicator, which is total wealth, private wealth as a share of national income for a selection of high-income countries. The ratio doubled for countries like Germany, UK, Japan, and France, and even more than doubled or tripled for countries like my own, Italy. And this has also contributed to the increasing recognition of the fact that house of balance sheets are shaping the functioning of our macroeconomy and our society. But most importantly, there has been a considerable amount of empirical evidence suggesting that economic inequality has been on the rise, at least since the 1980s. And this graph shows that on average, for a group of high-income economies, the share of income accruing to the richest 1% has grown by 32% from mid-1980s to post-2010 period. And similarly, top wealth shares have increased on average by 23%. The graph also shows that wealth is much more concentrated than income, at least twice as much on average. And also, on the account of higher level of wealth concentration, the relative change over time has been more moderate compared to income concentration. Although income and wealth are strongly correlated, the correlation is definitely not perfect. And the focus on wealth distribution alone may provide also very different information than the focus on income distribution. So in the rest of the talk, I'm going to focus on the concept of advantages of wealth. And I will also briefly define what we mean by net wealth and how it is composed. I will then move on to some evidence about the growing relevance of private wealth in the economy. After this introduction to these conceptual issues, I will focus much more on the data and the methodology, especially the methodologies related to the measurement of wealth concentration and distribution and inequality. And before concluding, I will dwell briefly on the main determinants of wealth accumulation and focus more on the role of inheritance and wealth transfers more broadly. And then I will conclude. What are the advantages of wealth? So wealth is a complex phenomenon which is linked to predetermined decision by individuals and households. And these decisions are taken over time, over the years, and accumulate over time. So past, present, future, and also distant future matter for wealth accumulation and for wealth more broadly. This creates a series of conceptual issues that are not necessarily easy to be solved. So the most important role that wealth takes is that of a store of value, of reserve for present and future consumption. So according to the neoclassical view, all assets are generally fungible, and wealth is more or less a substitute for income in order to appease consumption desires at different stages of the life cycle. So wealth can be cashed in or collateralized in order to derive streams of income that are then used to face expected or unexpected life cycle needs, such as having a baby or buying a home or becoming unemployed. All these expected and unexpected needs throughout life cycle. So wealth therefore becomes a source of security and a source of income. This particular dimension of wealth as a source of security to cushion the life uncertainties becomes self-evident during the COVID-19 health-related crisis. In Italy, for instance, the median level of liquid savings, so cash or near cash, in the first 4 deciles of the personal income distribution is approximately equal to 2,500 euro. This means that at least 20% of Italian adults have less than 2,500 euro to count on, which can be useful approximately to sustain living standard at the absolute poverty threshold for a couple of months. So the qualitative feature of this graph may not be necessarily different across countries, although some of the details might be. So if you belong to the bottom of the distribution and you are also more likely to lose the job and work in an informal and precarious job condition. So in those cases, it is also very likely that you have very little liquid savings and liquid financial wealth more broadly to face and to count on in order to face the liquidity shock or the economic crisis. And perhaps you're also less protected on average by standard social protection measures. Wealth does not just act as a source of income or as a store of value, but it's very important because it enhances the spectrum of opportunities of individuals, as it expands the freedom to choose, to plan ahead, to circumvent capital constraints and imperfection in the capital market. Not everybody can borrow, and not everybody can definitely overcome borrowing constraints without collaterals. And so people can choose also to refuse a precarious or unsatisfactory job condition, can choose the most appropriate education and training course, can derive a much more fruitful investment decision, or can decide to invest their money and have better return for it, and take up a loan to set up a business activity or an entrepreneurial activity, and also decide to spend their money on a gap year to travel the world and find inspiration. So in sum, wealth allows people to have access to better opportunities and chances in life. So beyond these two main advantages of wealth, which have been described so far and were defined by Tony Atkinson as the right to income, another important advantage of wealth is what Tony Atkinson himself called the right to convey property. And the right to convey property to others, for instance, or to future generations via bequest, inheritance, and gifts. Or the right to convey property to others or to society at large via philanthropic donations and grants. So the amount of wealth owned or donated has clearly important effect on our perceived social status, as it can be an indirect measure of performance, success, or ability and merit, or a way also to obtain social and moral recognition in a society. And therefore, the value of wealth is not exclusively measured in terms of the utility flows generated from consumption. Therefore, wealth also brings utility flows that are not necessarily related to consumption, and therefore wealth can also enter the utility function itself. We now, therefore, enter a so-called neo-Kaldorian view, where wealth is seen as a source of economic and political power, as a source of social influence, and wealth also as a source of control of productive resources, control of industries, control of the allocation of factor of productions, and control essentially of other people's life. And so think about the relationship between a renter and a landlord, a relationship between a debtor and creditor, or an employee and an employer. These are clear examples of these power relations. And a more direct consequence of this view is that wealth is intrinsically heterogeneous, and different assets are not necessarily fungible. And the composition of portfolios start to matter a lot. So which assets should we include in the definition of wealth, and how should they be valued? Which is the most appropriate unit of analysis? Should we take household size and composition into account? All these questions and answers depend on the objective of our analysis, and they're not necessarily easy to solve. But let me take a step back now, and let me define what we mean with net wealth. So if we were asking a person to disclose her possessions, she would probably start an inventory list from her tangible possessions, starting from the house, valuables, the car, furniture, and other durables. However, wealth is also composed of intangible assets, which are typically a list of claims against others. So against the government, such as cash, government bonds, government pensions, but also claims against financial institutions. Think about investment funds, saving deposits, life insurance, pension funds, or finally also claims against firms and companies more broadly, occupational pensions, shares, bonds. Once we are sort of taking all these different assets into account, we can sum all the financial assets, we can sum the financial assets to the non-financial assets, and we subtract all the liabilities and debt. So this is the definition of net wealth. As you have understood, right now, given the complexity of wealth definition and depending on the objective of the analysis and on the theoretical and conceptual framework under investigation, we can adopt different definitions of wealth. So most importantly, here, there is no such a thing as the definition of wealth. Having said that, it might nonetheless be useful to have a benchmark to start with. So, and such a reference point can be the System of National Accounts definition of net worth, which essentially takes all the financial assets and real assets and liabilities that we described so far, except the Social Security benefits and except the durables, which are not included. The reason why we're taking this national account definition as a benchmark is not necessarily because this is the most precise definition of wealth, but because it definitely guarantees us a certain degree of comparability across countries, and also because it rests on careful and coordinated research over the course of decades at the macroeconomic level. So if we zoom in each country, we can represent the growing relevance of wealth as the average households, let's say, facing a sea of debt, which is represented here by this blue area, and a growing mountains of different types of assets. This is what I've called the wealth topography here. And this graph represents the evolution of US per capita net personal wealth, together with the evolution of the aggregate wealth portfolio of US households. And this has grown from $80,000 in 1970 to approximately $250,000 in more recent years. The gray area here represents the total housing stock, witnessing the substantial weight in the aggregate wealth portfolio of this asset. Cash deposits and bond securities, the black area there, have been steadily increasing in importance throughout the period, and same occurred to direct stock holding, although they're a bit more volatile because they depend on the market circumstances, which are represented by the sort of yellowish area. And indirect holdings, the white area, meaning that households are more and more delegating bond and shareholding to pension and insurance funds. And this can also be, to some extent, an indication that as the government retreats from the full protection of household life cycle needs, households need to rely more and more on their own savings. So, of course, this picture may be different across countries, and different countries may have different features. So if I flip to another country, indeed, the sort of the deepness of the sea of debt, as well as the height of the asset mountains, may be different across countries. And this is clearly visible when I move from the US, in this case, to Italy. And visibly, the change of color is actually quite dramatic. And the relative weight of housing, so the gray area, you can see that is much higher in Italy. On the contrary, the blue area is much lower, is much smaller in Italy, meaning that Italian households are much less indebted compared to the US counterparts. And the white area of insurance technical reserves, so the reserves held in private pension funds and insurance funds, has been steadily increasing in Italy too, but the levels are substantially lower, reflecting also the higher generosity, perhaps, of the public pension and the public health system in the country. So let me start by giving you some overview about the estimation of wealth concentration and inequality and what type of data and methodology we are using. But before doing that, let me start by giving you a nice quotation from Tony Atkinson about the importance of statistics on wealth distribution. The statistics on wealth distribution play a key political role, and they are as sensitive an issue as the balance of payments or unemployment figures. This means that it is all the more important that they should be firmly based, and we should examine critically the evidence and the assumption underlying it. In many of his presentation and written work, Tony Atkinson also used a quotation from Zvi Grilich's, the Harvard econometrician, and which is very timely and revealing quote. And Grilich's wrote, the available economic statistics are our main windows on economic behavior. And in spite of the scratches and persistent fogging, we cannot stop peering through it and trying to understand what is happening. And Tony went on usually adding that each data source could be thought has a different window of observation, and each of these windows provides an imperfect view, but also partial and related view on the same object of analysis, which in this case is the wealth distribution. And I find this quotation particularly revealing and important to keep in mind. So in our case, the object of analysis is the pyramid of wealth. So we like to analyze and observe the whole distribution of wealth. There are 5 main different windows of observation on this wealth pyramid. And it's fair to say that estimates on wealth distribution are somewhat much less settled than those on income distribution. And there is also much more controversy about how wealth inequality and concentration has been evolving over time in recent years, especially in countries like the US. And of course, it is partly due to the elusive nature of wealth measurement, but also it also due to the heterogeneity of different sources of data and method to estimate wealth inequality. And so these 5 main different windows of observation of wealth are related to some administrative tax data, but also to household survey data and to other type of data, which is, for instance, the rich list, which are generally journalistic type of sources, which can also provide informative content on the concentration of wealth, especially at the very top. So the ideal and most direct source of information would be a wealth census or register documented all assets and liabilities held in possession by the full population. And this somewhat exists in some countries, especially some of the Scandinavian countries, but and is typically associated to some form of recurrent wealth taxation, but it's very rare to observe such data. Another direct information on wealth holding comes from the administration of estate or inheritance taxes. And this, however, only deals with the decedent population. So it's an indirect observation of the living population, but it's a direct observation of wealth holding. And typically covers only the upper part of the distribution and obviously observe the wealth possession at the end of a person's life. And then we have information on capital income taxation, representing therefore information on returns to the underlying stock of wealth, providing therefore an indirect observation point on wealth holdings. Household survey data finally cover in principle all population and ask households to self-declare their net assets and their valuation. So each source has its own strengths and weaknesses, and each of these sources has somewhat a form of underreporting linked to the data source. So data obviously suffer from tax avoidance and tax evasion issues and completeness of the tax base, and household survey data may be affected by differential underreporting and no response rates. And I will talk more in details about that. It's fair to say also that there is a growing recognition of the fact that each of these sources may have some issues, and therefore there is a considerable value in a multi-source approach because no single method and source is sufficient on its own. And therefore there is growing reliance on hybrid method mixing and leveraging the strength of different data sources, and also trying to align and reconcile wealth with external totals, such as the national accounts total. So one of this method is so-called distributional national account method, which brings together administrative tax data together with household survey data to match national accounts statistics. And one of the main advantages here is also the importance of coverage of total population as well as total wealth. So let me start jumping in the detailed description of all sources. So I will start from the wealth register data. Here is the window of observation. It is a large window on the pyramid of wealth. This is typically associated to wealth tax data, as I said before, but very few countries nowadays have a tax on wealth, so especially a recurrent tax on wealth. And other countries also discontinued recently such a tax. We have some form of taxation in Italy. There is some form of wealth tax in Argentina, Colombia, France, Switzerland, Netherlands, and also Norway and Spain. But when we deal in practice with this source of data, first of all, it's important to recognize that this windows of observation, in theory, it is very large, but in practice, because most of the times the wealth register is linked to a wealth tax source, the windows of observation is actually relatively small because it covers only a subset of the population, typically at the top of the distribution. And the glass of this window is not necessarily clear, as I said before, and from the quotation from Zvick-Ehrlich's, these glasses may have some scratches on it. And there might be also some fogging that allows a very unclear view on the pyramid of wealth. And this is actually what happens. And there might be also some higher exemption threshold and also some tax-exempt assets, which require some imputation of information. For instance, assets held in private pension funds or private insurance funds are typically exempted from taxation of this kind. Then we have capital income tax data. These typically have a much greater coverage, but as I said before, they provide an indirect view on wealth information because they rely on the information on the flows of income that is generated from different asset classes. Therefore, we observe YK, which is capital income, and we need to apply returns to each single asset class, RK, to derive the underlying stock of wealth, which is WK. And this is a so-called Giffen method, and is a relatively old method. And in practice, the main scratches on the windows of capital income tax data are related to the fact that some of the capital income may not necessarily be taxed. For instance, the most classic example is the imputed capital income that is generated from owning a house. And this capital income is not necessarily taxed, actually most often is non-taxed. And therefore, it is impossible to recover from this method the underlying stock of housing assets. And we need to rely on additional sources of data, typically household survey data or other administrative sources of data to impute this important asset class. And also there might be issues related to the covariance between the wealth level and returns of each single assets class, to the extent that this might create a bias in the estimation of wealth concentration. And obviously, like any bias, we need to rely on empirical evidence to assess the quantitative importance of such bias. Together with the capitalization method, one of the oldest methods is the one that relies on information of wealth and possession at death, which are typically contained in the tax source administration data, which relates to the administration of estate and inheritance taxes. One of the main advantages here is that sometimes relies on taxes which remain relatively stable over the course of many decades, and so sometimes over a century, and so it provides comparable source of information throughout the years. And of course, here there is a different kind of pyramid. It relates, as I said before, to the decedent population, not the living population. And the estate multiplier method here, the way it works is that we need to take into consideration the mortality rates of each single individual, especially by demographic classes, because essentially death here is treated as a sampling device of the population. So the grossing up factors are the inverse of the mortality rates by, let's say, strata, so age, gender, marital status, or geographical areas. But some of the scratches linked to this method are related to the fact that, first of all, the coverage is not necessarily full. Some of the individuals with very little wealth holdings may not necessarily come to know this to the tax authority when they die, and so we need to impute the so-called missing population and their wealth holdings. And also, as usual, some of the assets may be totally exempted from taxation. Again, insurance funds or pension funds sometimes are excluded from taxation, but many other asset types can be excluded too, depending on the countries. Similarly to the context of capital income tax data, there is also another, there is another potential source of bias, which is linked to the potential covariance between the estate level and the mortality rate. So namely the fact that wealthy people tend to live longer and have lower mortality rates. So if we don't take that into account, we might be biased downward. The potential estimates of wealth concentration derived from this method. So here is an example of a country in which stock wealth shares can be estimated from both estate and capitalization method. And the two series here are represented for the US and track each other pretty well till mid-1980s. And there they start to diverge. So there is an ongoing effort to try to fully reconcile the two series on the account of differential mortality rates and differential rate of returns. So namely, sort of considering the two sources of bias I've discussed before, underlining the two different methods. But there might be also other important differences that might well be important in driving the difference that we observe here. First of all, the quality of the data may be different, and the nature of the tax avoidance and tax evasion underlining the two different tax data can be quite different. Also, it is important to recall here that one of the series, the capitalization method series, is fully reconciled with the national accounts, whereas the other, so the estate-based method series, is not. So here is the fourth window of observation. So in principle, this source can be an ideal source, but in principle, it suffers from a series of issues which affect their suitability to capture well the wealth holding at the very top of the distribution, but also at the very bottom of the distribution. And in fact, as you can see, the windows of observation here on the pyramid is somewhat trimmed on the bottom and on the top to witness the fact that this source of data may have some issues in capturing well what is happening at the top and at the bottom. And there are different reasons for this to be true. So there is systematic underreporting or no reporting and item no response, or even unit no response, which may be systematically correlated with the object of investigation here, which is the economic status or wealth status. So wealthy households may be less willing to cooperate. They are harder to find, and even if they agree to answer, they might not be willing to fully disclose their wealth portfolios. And moreover, wealth distribution is highly skewed, and a normal random sort of sample without systematic oversampling of the wealthy households may bias the estimation of standard moments of the distribution. So to overcome these issues, typically survey statistics deploy different methods to oversample wealthy households. But even with oversampling of the right tail of distributions or the upper end of the distribution, some survey may exclude publicly known wealth individuals from the survey design, typically individuals in the top rich list, so Forbes rich list or anything like that. There are also design issues which exclude, by definition, segments of the population at the very bottom of the distributions, let's say institutionalized individuals and families, such as jailed individuals, or individuals in elderly care institutions, homeless individuals, for instance, are also excluded by design. So what happens when we use household survey data? Typically, we get a picture like that. This is a picture for the UK, represented in the black series, the estate-based method concentration of wealth for the top 1% richest individuals in the country. And in the relatively a clear gray squares is a series representing what happens if we estimate the top 1% wealth shares using the household survey data. So typically, household survey data tend to underestimate the wealth concentration in the country. But this is not necessarily the case in all countries. This is an example for the US, where the SCF line with triangles represents the Service of Consumer Finance, which has a dual sampling frame, which actually oversample the wealthy households and takes that into account in a way that seems to be fully reconcilable with, or partially reconcilable with, the levels of concentration of the series based on capitalization. So we have defined wealth and described the main sources of data on wealth and the most important methods of estimation to derive measures of wealth inequality and concentration. But at this stage, it's also fundamental to gain insights about the main drivers of wealth accumulation over time, as this can have substantial and fundamental policy implications. Okay, so there are three main forces driving the individual accumulation of wealth. So first, wealth is clearly generated from savings out of earned income, as individuals save during their working life and they save through retirement. Second, individuals may receive donations or inheritance throughout their lives, adding to the stock of existing wealth. So finally, the existing stock of real and financial assets tend to reproduce themselves, and financial wealth, for instance, generates capital income, can be saved, and assets may appreciate or depreciate over time. So these processes also are interconnected to the tax system. So taxes on income reduces the amount of disposable income that can be saved. Capital income tax and wealth tax reduce the return to wealth, and inheritance and state taxation reduce the amount of wealth that can be transferred. All these together can have substantial effect on the long run equilibrium of wealth concentration. And these processes also described so far tend to also be interdependent and can apply with different strengths across the wealth distribution. A rich individual, for instance, may have higher saving rates, higher chances of receiving a substantial inheritance or donation in life, as well as higher returns on each of her assets compared to a poorer individuals. And furthermore, these processes may be persistent across generations, as earnings, savings, and investment abilities can be transferred from parents to children, generating powerful multiplicative effect on the concentration of wealth. For the sake of time, I'm going to focus mostly here on the inheritance component, which has been attracting a growing amount of attention, and it has also been relatively understudied as a topic, I believe. There's growing evidence that the rise in the wealth income ratio that I documented at the beginning of my talk led to an increase in the wealth being passed from one generation to the next. So in other words, the empirical importance of inheritance and inter vivos gifts has been growing over time. And this speaks directly to the concerns raised in the book by Thomas Piketty, Capital in the 21st Century, that underline very clearly the risk of rising relative importance of inherited intergenerational advantages in transforming our society into patrimonial economies where parental wealth becomes key to determining life chances and opportunities of individuals. So whether intergenerational wealth transfers increase or decrease wealth concentration level is a fundamental but also very controversial question. There has been attracting a growing amount of research attention. To understand the impact of inheritance on economic inequality, it is certainly not enough to show that its aggregate size is increasing over time, like I'm showing here right now. Obviously, this depends also on who receives inheritance, when they receive them, and also depends on their existing level of wealth and how inheritances impact on consumption, investment, and saving choices. So these are all very complex issues, which clearly we cannot disentangle in a few minutes. But let me give you one important piece of information concerning the relative concentration of wealth transfers across the wealth distribution. Here is an example for the UK and the US. So between 65.4 and 83.8% of total transfers are concentrated in families which already belong to the fourth quartile of the wealth distribution in the UK and the US respectively. And most of these transfers go to households who were in the top decile of the wealth distribution. So wealth transfer, inheritance, and gifts are highly concentrated. Also, despite the growing relevance of personal wealth and inheritance, and growing concentration of wealth and high level of concentration of wealth transfers, the tax revenue obtained from taxation of wealth transfers, inheritance, gifts, and estate declined and even dropped to zero in some countries. So moreover, most of this drop may be conducted to reduce tax burden on the top of the distribution and also reduced tax progressivity. This, I believe, is particularly worrisome because irrespectively of whether or not wealth is becoming more or less unequal because of inheritances, it is important to stress that the current distribution of wealth is becoming in many countries more distant from a sort of reasonable approximation of merit. So finally, it is important to highlight that the relative strength of each wealth accumulation determinant may be time varying. And this graph shows an example for Italy of the flows of inheritance and gifts as a share of national income compared to the household saving rate as a share of disposable income. Whereas the latter declined from 1995 to 2016 from 16% to 4% approximately, the inheritance share doubled from 7% to 14% approximately in the same period. So more and more wealth is coming from the past, and less wealth has been accumulated through savings. Just some concluding remarks. Personal wealth and inheritance gifts have been growing over time. and their concentration is increasing over time. Yet, we still believe, despite substantial improvement in the statistics to measure these trends and this phenomena, we need much more investments in official statistics to gain more insights and expand our knowledge on these important topics. Tax data and household survey data have shown are complements and not necessarily substitute, and there is no single method that is sufficient on its own, because each single source is open to challenge, and therefore multi-source approaches are a fruitful avenue of research. And I also believe that more emphasis should perhaps be given to the existing uncertainties that are surrounding existing estimates. We also shown that the relative contribution of inheritance for wealth accumulation is an understudied topic, and more broadly, there is very little agreement on what exactly is driving wealth concentration, and therefore much more research should be devoted to this topic. In light of this evidence, policies that I believe are worth discussing are those who incentivize accumulation of wealth at the bottom and discourage too much accumulation at the top in order to prevent self-made wealth today to become inherited wealth and advantages tomorrow. So wealth transfer taxation, such as inheritance tax, estate tax, and gift tax, should be preserved and strengthened, and different wealth taxation should be assessed and discussed. I would like to thank you for the attention, and also I would like to thank my co-author and collaborators and assistant, who are obviously not responsible for this talk.